This diagram shows the long-run equilibrium position for the economy, where short-run aggregate supply equals aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply. We're going to look first of all at expansionary shocks in the economy that change this equilibrium position. We know that any change in the determinants of aggregate demand will shift the aggregate demand curve. An expansionary shock, such as a reduction in corporation tax, would increase investment expenditure. This would then shift the aggregate demand curve, as shown in this diagram. In this diagram, there has been an increase in the price level and in national income. At point B, actual national income is higher than potential at point A. This has caused an inflationary gap. We could also call it a positive output gap. The inflationary gap causes wages to rise much faster than productivity. We can see in the diagram the price level moving from P to P1. However, this is the first way that the inflationary gap can be corrected, as wages and prices are pushed up due to excess demand. The short-run aggregate supply curve will now shift to the left as firms seek to pass on these increased costs by increasing their prices. This method does correct the inflationary gap, but as the diagram shows, it returns the economy to full employment at a higher price level. In this diagram, we can see that aggregate demand has moved out to the right. This has been caused by an expansionary shock, and this has caused an inflationary gap. The second way to correct an inflationary gap is through demand management of aggregate demand. The government could introduce a contractionary fiscal policy, such as raising taxes or cutting spending. This would shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, correcting the inflationary gap. As this diagram shows, the advantage of this method is that it returns the economy to equilibrium, but at a lower price level than the first method. However, the disadvantage is that if the negative multiplier has not been calculated correctly, the national income may be pushed so low as to cause a recession. Contractionary shocks. If we return now to the example of an economy at long-run equilibrium, a decline in aggregate demand could be caused by a contractionary shock. This could be a change in the determinants of aggregate demand, such as a reduction in export sales. This diagram shows that the shift of aggregate demand has caused a recessionary gap. There are two ways to correct a recessionary gap. Firstly, the fact that the economy is operating at point A, following the shift of aggregate demand to AD1, means that unemployment will be increasing and consumer and business confidence will be falling. With this, there will be downward pressure on wages and prices. This downward pressure will start to reduce the costs of production, resulting in a shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve to AS1 and a new equilibrium at point B. To recap, the economy saw a downturn as aggregate demand shifted inwards. Then cheaper costs of production moved the short-run aggregate supply curve out and moved the economy back to full employment at point B. Note, the economy is back to full employment but at a lower price level. The second way to correct a recessionary gap is for the government to implement an expansionary fiscal policy. They could do this by lowering tax or increasing their spending. The advantage of this could be that it is likely to be quicker than waiting for wages and prices to fall, as the first solution suggested. The disadvantage is that the government's fiscal stimulant may misjudge the size of the positive multiplier and overshoot the long-run aggregate supply, and an inflationary gap is then created. Or the government's fiscal stimulant might coincide with an upturn in the economy, and when these two combine, the aggregate demand curve would again overshoot the long-run aggregate supply curve and cause an inflationary gap.